Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Nada Hazem, a PhD student in both Cairo University and the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. First of all, I'm so happy to be here today to present the first version of my paper, Environmental Provisions in Trade Agreements and Films Performance, Evidence from Egyptian Film Level Data. Of course, it's still a work in progress, and I'd be happy to receive any recommendations or suggestions regarding how to improve my paper. First of all, this paper builds on the literature regarding the deep trade agreements that were referred to earlier today. So the last 2 decades have witnessed a surge not only in the number of PTAs signed among different countries, but also in the depth of these PTAs, because as we have seen, PTAs are no longer limited to the tariff reduction and trade facilitation issue, but they were extended to cover some additional policy areas. And in this paper, I'm mainly focusing on the environment-related provisions part that are included in the PTAs. And this question of compatibility between trade liberalization and environmental protection has been longly debated both in the literature and also during the formulation of public policies, whether trade and environmental goals can be pursued together or they may be conflicting. This impact of environmental policies on trade, it becomes even a more pronounced issue in the case of developing countries that usually lack the required technology to comply with environmental rules and move towards a greener production process. However, despite the increase in the number and scope of environmental provisions in PTAs, their effects on trade is very rarely tackled in the literature. And in this regard, this paper aims to answer the following question: what is the impact of environmental provisions in PTAs on the Egyptian film's export performance during the period 2005 to 2016? And why exactly this research question? This is based mainly on different strands of literature. A first strand focused on studying the effect of domestic environmental regulations on trade at both the country and sectoral levels. And in this case, the paper used different proxies for regulation stringency, such as the pollution abatement costs, the environmental expenditures, or the energy consumption. However, the literature on the effect of the environmental content of the PTAs on trade, it's still very scarce. To the best of our knowledge, only 2 papers tackle this effect, but they were also conducted at both either the country or at the sectoral level. While for the remaining studies that tackled the issue of environmental provisions in trade agreements, they focus instead on examining the design itself of the PTA and what are the factors that can explain the inclusion of such provisions in the trade agreements. And we can also say that the study builds on the literature of trade and film heterogeneity that was first introduced by Militz in 2003, because since films tend to have different levels of productivity, they will then be affected differently by the introduction of an environmental policy. And in this case, only the most productive films will be able to bear the additional compliance cost, while the least productive films will be forced to exit the market. So we can say that this paper contributes to the literature in 3 main aspects. So first, the paper conducts the analysis at the film level, unlike the majority of papers that examine the impact at either the country or sectoral level. Second, this is one of the first papers to tackle the issue in a MENA region country. Third, the paper doesn't only consider the mere presence of environmental provisions in PTAs, but it also examines the enforceability level of these provisions. Moving to some stylized facts using our data. We can observe in figure 1 that the number of PTAs with environmental provisions has been increasing since 1957. Besides the scope itself of the environmental provisions that are included, it was also enlarged, because in figure 2 we can see that there was an increase in the number of types of environmental provisions that are included in the PTAs. For instance, in 2015 and 2016, we can see some agreements that include around 34 types of environmental provisions. So what are those types? We can further investigate this through the data on Egypt. So Egypt has mainly signed 5 PTAs that include environmental provisions. And we can see that some provisions aimed at establishing a balance between the environmental and the trade goals. And by that, I mean, for instance, allowing for the country to derogate from the agreement for environmental protection reasons, and so on. And we also have other provisions that refer to the enforcement mechanism that will be used in order to enforce the environmental commitments in the PTA. And by enforcement mechanism, I mean, for instance, requiring from the country to adopt certain judicial or administrative procedures to enforce the domestic environmental laws, or referring to some dispute settlement that can be used in case of failure of consultation, for example. And of course, we have other categories of environmental provisions, the ones that refer to the existence of external assistance for the country, either financial or technical, and so on. So regarding the data and the methodology part, so the study makes use of 2 main data sources. So for the data on environmental provisions, we use the World Bank's Deep Trade Agreements database. And for the express data, we use the Egyptian firm level customs data that is collected by the General Organization for Export and Import Control, and the GOEIC. And the data are published by the Economic Research Forum. So for the model part, so we used a gravity type model that has the following specification. Since our goal here is to estimate the effect of environmental provisions in PTAs on both the intensive and the extensive margins of trade, our main dependent variable will be taking several forms. So first, to measure the effect on the intensive margin, the dependent variable represents the value of exports of a certain product S from firm I to country J in a certain year T. As for the extensive margin, we use 4 different variables to measure it. As you can see in number 2, we use a dummy variable that takes 1 if the firm exports a positive value of the product to a certain destination, to measure the export participation probability of the firm. In number 3, we used also another dummy that take 1 if the firm exports a positive value of the product in the current year, but didn't export it in the previous year T-1, and this to measure the firm entry probability. In number 4, we used another dummy that takes 1 if the firm exported a positive value in the previous year T-1, but no longer exports it in the current year in order to measure the firm exit probability. And finally, we have also used the number of exported products by firm year and destination. So for the explanatory variables, we have included the GDP of the importing country and other gravity variables from the ZP database. So we have the geographical distance that separates the country I and country G, and country I here will be always Egypt in this case. We have also interrogated some other dummies that take 1 if the 2 countries share a common border, if they have any colonial links, or if they have common legal origins. We have also included the average applied tariff rate at the HS6 digit level. So year, firm, and product mix effects were also included to account for any unobserved heterogeneities that may influence the trade patterns. And we have tried other combinations of fixed effects, time-varying ones, as we are going to see later. So for our main independent variable, the PTA1, So it is a categorical variable that was constructed using two methods. So in a first step, we focus on the presence or the non-presence of the environmental provisions in the PTA. So in this case, the variable, it takes 0 if there is no PTA between the two countries, 1 if there is a PTA between the two countries but doesn't include environmental provisions, and 2 if the PTA includes environmental provisions. In a second step, we conduct a further distinction among the PTAs that include environmental provisions based on the enforcement mechanism criteria. So in this case, the variable will take 2 if the PTA that include environmental provisions the provisions are subject to one enforcement mechanism, and we take 3 if the provisions were subject to more than one enforcement mechanism. So for the estimation methods, we used a Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood technique to estimate the effect on the intensive margin, and that is because we have a large share of bilateral zero trade flows. They represent around 86% of our data, and hence applying directly the OLS will imply a selection bias issue, and this is why we use the PPML. We also used a linear probability model to estimate the effect on the exit participation, the entry probability, and the exit probability dummies. And finally, an OLS to estimate the effect on the number of exported products. So moving to the empirical findings. So in table 1, we have the results regarding the intensive margin. So the table provides first a comparison between using OLS versus using PPML, and we can clearly notice the big drop in the number of observations when using the OLS compared to the PPML. And this is why we mainly rely on the results that are shown in column 2 using the PPML technique. As we can see that the PTA that doesn't include environmental provision, it has a negative effect on the expert value compared to the case of not having a PTA at all. But the PTA that include environmental provisions, they do have a positive and significant effect on the expert value. So in column, in table 2, when we investigate how the effect may change when we differentiate between the agreements based on the enforcement mechanism that they include, we can see that the effect, it maintains its positive sign, either we have one or more than one enforcement mechanism, as you can see in column 1. Okay, so in column 2, what we try to do is to establish a further distinction among the different types of to see how the effect might change when considering the dirty goods versus the green goods. And before showing the results, I just wanted to clarify that by dirty goods here, we mean the goods that incur the highest levels of pollution abatement cost. And actually, it's a list that was identified earlier by law, and that is used mostly by all of by the majority, I can say, of the literature papers. And for the green goods, we mean the goods that are used to measure, prevent, or limit the environmental damage. Of course, we do not have a unique list for this type of products, and this is why we rely on a combination of the two most commonly accepted lists of environmental goods, the list provided by the OECD, and also the list of environmental goods that was elaborated by the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation countries when they wanted to negotiate the issue of tariff reduction on environmental goods. So going back now to our table, so we can see that in column 2, environmental provisions into the agreements, they do have a positive and significant effect on the export value of the green products. However, what's a bit surprising is that they also have a positive effect on the exports of dirty goods. And actually, I think that this is an issue that I should be further investigation to know what is the mechanism behind having such a positive effect on dirty exports, because one would expect that environmental provisions are supposed to reduce the dirty exports. And now moving to the extensive margin results. There are no surprises in here. We still have a positive effect of environmental provisions on the firm exit probability, regardless of the number of enforcement mechanisms. We do have also a positive effect on the firm entry probability. At the same time, environmental provisions, they reduce the firm exit probability, and they have a positive effect on the number of products by firm destination and year. So before moving to the conclusion, we conducted some robustness checks. So first, we tried to use different combinations of fixed effects and rerun the regression. For instance, we used the firm year and product fixed effects, as well as the firm product and year fixed effects. In a second step, we wanted also to ensure that the resultant coefficients are not mainly driven by the exports of the large firms, and this is why we examined the change in the effect when we drop the large exporters from the analysis. And actually, it could be also considered as a way to address the potential indigeneity problem that we may have in here, and which is stemming from the reverse causality between experts and environmental provisions, meaning that the level of expert itself, it can affect the inclusion of environmental provisions in PTAs. And since large firms are the ones that tend to have high lobbying power and can hence influence the decisions of policymakers, eliminating them from the regression could control for this potential source of indigeneity. And we found that our results were robust to the two tests. Now we can move to the conclusion. So as you have seen, the results indicate that included environmental provisions in PTAs, they do not have an inhibitive or restrictive effect of trade, but they have a positive effect on both the intensive and extensive margins. We have found also that the effect of environmental provisions, it tends to be more pronounced when they are supported by more than one enforcement mechanism. And actually, maybe I forgot to point it out in here. Here in column 1 in the intensive margin results, you can see that the coefficient tends to be greater when we have more than one enforcement mechanism. We have found also that the environmental provisions, they do stimulate the exports of green products. However, they are not effective in hindering the exports of dirty products by the Egyptian firms. We have some preliminary policy recommendations that we can deduct from the results. So the results are reassuring to the policymakers regarding the inclusion of environmental provisions. Trade and environmental objectives, they can be pursued together. They are not contradictory. And hence, implementing measures that do encourage the producers to innovate and invest in greener and more efficient technologies, it could strengthen this positive effect of environmental provisions on the experts. And finally, of course, the quality of institutions would be a crucial element here in order to enforce the environmental commitments in the PTA and reduce the exports of dirty products. Finally, regarding the limitations of the research, so first, of course, there is a lack of more recent data on the Egyptian firms experts. We do not have available data after 2016. And the results, they may still suffer from the indigeneity problem that I've just mentioned. And this is why the next version of the paper, I'm working on controlling for this problem using the right instruments. And what I'm thinking about is using the institutional quality of the partner country as a possible instrument for including environmental provisions in PTAs, because we would expect that the higher the institutional quality of the partner country, the higher the likelihood that we are going to have environmental provisions in the trade agreement. Finally, it would also be interesting to examine how the firm's characteristics can influence the effect of environmental provisions on the export performance, for instance, such as the effect on the firm's productivity. But in this case, we would have to use another data set, because the database that we have, we only have data on the experts. We do not have any firm's characteristics variables in the data. And I'm going to stop here, and I would like to thank you for your attention and waiting for any of your comments. Thank you.